and for society. Now, healthy design must be inclusive for populations with limited health literacy. In this webinar, we'll propose 4 characteristics of inclusive technology and share specific examples from our work at Communicate Health of how we are using an inclusive design approach to maximize the potential to build a more socially and economically just and healthy world. I'm Taryn. I'm an experienced researcher at Communicate Health, focused on human-centered design to solve complex usability problems.
Hi, I'm Marika Phillips. I'm a senior designer at Communicate Health. I've been in the field for about 10 years and at Communicate Health for about 5.
So getting started. Oh.
So just a little intro on Communicate Health. We are a team of plain language writers, designers, usability specialists, researchers, health educators, just a whole bunch of different backgrounds, all focused on using a user-centered design process to better design health information and help our clients create products and services that can be easily accessed, understood, and used by the people who need them the most.
So let's jump in with a collaborative activity. Well, just start thinking about what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of accessibility. So get those words in mind, and then we'll ask all of you to go to slido.com, and I can chat out the link. And enter 86203. In doing that, we're going to create a word cloud and just see what some of those top words that we have in mind are. Let's give this a few moments to get our words in. All right, looks like we have some great thoughts coming in. We have inclusion and inclusive are pretty prominent, as well as equal access, disability, screen reader, disability. Yeah, these are really great.
Yeah, it's not surprising to me that there's a focus on disability. That's often what comes to mind first for folks when we think of accessibility. So we're going to revisit this later. So the second, yeah, go ahead.
The second activity, I'd like for you all to identify a website or app that you created or that you especially like. And then using this rating scale below, please rate its performance in the following areas from 1 to 10, with 1 specifically meaning, or with 10 being the best. Let's just take a few moments and hold on to these, and we'll revisit this later.
Okay, great. So the the first concept we're going to go over is the WCAG. Some of you may be familiar with this already. What WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is published by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. These are the main international standards for the web. These recommendations are great, and they are there to make content more accessible on the web for people with disabilities. We definitely recommend that you use these guidelines, but also keep in mind that they're a starting point, and even if you were to follow these to the letter, you would still not be considering some needs of specific people in different populations. So first, we want to go beyond the WCAG by considering cultural differences. So something that's not included in those guidelines is something like the difference in color meanings across different cultures. So a great example of that is the color red in Western culture might mean something like love or passion. It could mean danger. But for cultures in Nigeria and South Africa, these colors mean like bloodshed, war, violence. And so if you were designing a product for folks who were from those areas, you would want to consider what cultural differences they might have with color. Another great example of this is differences in symbolism. So for instance, there was a study done of people for whom English is their first language and for whom Chinese is their first language. And the folks for whom Chinese was their first language associated power with a dragon, and for folks who had English as their first language associated power with an eagle. And both of those groups disagreed with each other. So it's just really important to consider the culture of people who are in your audience. The next thing that we want to consider above and beyond the WCAG is neurodiversity. That includes things like vestibular disorders, autism, ADHD, epilepsy, a whole range of different ways that our brains work. And a good example of how this affects our web usability is for folks with vestibular disorders or even some autistic people, having autoplay videos or automatic movement can be not only disorienting, but actually give a physical reaction of dizziness or nausea. And then lastly, something we always want to consider is varied literacy levels. So this could be somebody for whom English is their second language, or somebody with dyslexia or dyscalculia, or just for somebody who reading is not their strong suit. So what I'm getting at here in giving all these different things that we're not considering in the WCAG is beyond accessibility is the concept of inclusivity. And that's what we're going to go into in the rest of the presentation.
So what is inclusive technology? Inclusion asks, is this safe for everyone to feel like they belong? So inclusive technology is accessible, it's empathetic, it's easy to understand and use for everyone, and it's designed and tested with the people who use it. So we're going to step through and take a closer look at each of these characteristics of inclusive technology through a design and research lens. So we'll show you in practice how Communicate Health went beyond accessibility to help everyone feel like they belong in the tools and products that we're developing. So in discussing accessibility, we mean accessible in the broadest sense of the term. In September 2019, the National Eye Institute, or NEI, launched a redesigned website to better meet the needs of its users. As part of this redesign, NEI took steps to ensure the website not only met, but exceeded accessibility standards. So to help achieve that goal, we built the site to accommodate assistive technologies like screen readers and accessibility features like page zooming to 200%. Now, in planning our research, we considered a few important factors. First was to accurately identify the key audience and segmentations that we'd be using. So National Eye Health Education Program partners extramural researchers, and consumers, so those who are actually diagnosed with eye diseases or conditions, all come from different standpoints, but all have their own unique use of the website. So in going through our recruitment and targeting which audiences to focus on, we made sure to include representation from each of these groups and factor these into our studies. Another key point in our research was to test on mobile. Users, especially those with limited literacy skills, are more likely to access information on mobile, so it's always important to test your website on mobile devices in addition to just the web. Also, in conducting research, especially as we're beginning to pull out findings, it's really notable to be aware of audience-specific findings. Sometimes it's really easy to identify these findings, note that they're not part of the larger trend, and maybe not consider them in reporting out. But these could indicate an accessibility limitation. When considered with all the data, these findings may seem negligible, but when considered by audience, highlighting the specific areas is a great way of seeking that improvement for all audiences. We still are working through some ongoing studies with this website, and wanted to share just some of the unique findings as they relate to accessibility. In a recent study with individuals that do use screen readers to view the site, an interesting fact that we pulled out was that the screen reader, JAWS, pronounces NEI as nay. So draws to that key point of some of the things that we may not notice or overlook outside of testing, and the challenges that acronyms can pose in seeking accessibility. Also seeing how screen readers and what you hear from the screen can create clutter, especially around images. So that's also especially important as we consider what images and what our focus is as we go into design work.
Yeah, and going into the design of this site a little bit here about how we went beyond accessibility for our specific audience of low vision users. You can see here we accommodated at least 200% zoom. So on the left-hand side, we have the page at 100%, and on the right, we have it at 200% zoom for folks who may need the text to be even larger in order to have it legible. We also accommodated high contrast mode. So you can see here on the left, again, is the site as it appears default, and on the right is high contrast mode for other folks who may have different needs in terms of their low vision. We also took into account supporting reduced motion for, as I said before, folks who may have vestibular disorders or epilepsy. And we also took into account performance on this site. It's very important that folks across the United States can access information about their eyes. So regardless of if they're living in a city or a rural area with slower internet, they need to be able to access this information. So just to review, what did we do? We identified our key audience of low vision users. As Taryn emphasized, we tested on mobile, and we designed for our key audience in mind. So not just making it accessible for everyone across the book, but for specifically low vision users. And just two examples of that was the high contrast mode and accommodating a 200% zoom. And this is just a rhetorical question here, but just to get you thinking, what from this example do you think you could put into your work? The next tool and the next topic we're going to talk about is empathy in our work. And this is empathy as it relates to the American Academy of Pediatrics motor delay tool. CH was hired by AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, to design and develop a web-based tool about physical developmental delays. We conducted focus groups with parents as formative research. And these were highly segmented, as Taryn will get into a little bit more. And as a result of those focus groups, we ended up developing this tool called What to Look For. And this is a tool to help educate parents and caregivers of young children up to age 5 who have concerns about their child's development.
So in investigating this tool, we conducted 5 focus groups with 5 different audiences. So those participants were either parents of typically developing children or parents of affected children, with additional segmentations dependent upon the child's age and different developmental areas. And so in conducting these focus groups, and we partnered with networks to recruit the identified parents. So when possible, it's really great to partner with community organizations to recruit participants in an approachable way outside of just plain language. So it's really important to meet participants where they are, and if and when possible, even shifting the testing location to go to a space where they feel most comfortable. So as we developed our additional materials, it was critical that we use empathetic, inclusive language, both when using our study materials and also going through initial testing of our study materials. Since in discussing this, we are discussing personal topics with these parents. Oh, in these focus groups, in addition to group discussions, we facilitated a collaging activity. So creative activities like these allow participants to articulate feelings, attitudes, and perspectives in ways that do not require writing or having the specific words to put to those emotions. So as we see here, this is just a brief sample of part of the collaging activity with some of the quotes that participants shared during those focus groups. So on the left, we see a dark image, and the participant said, "This was just scary. It evokes the unknown, and that could be scary for a parent, not knowing." So capturing an image like this helps them to share some of these emotions, as well as provide fodder for discussion around what they could be feeling in relation to the development of their child. And then similarly on the right, another image that showcases some of the fears or emotions there. It's a lack of care, disregard, or isolation. Whoever is writing should be saying, "You're not alone in this," and give you some hope. So in reading these quotes and seeing these images, this helps us to get a better understanding and better connect with these users to then facilitate findings and then recommendations that would best serve them and meet them where they are. So as researchers, it's important to think about how the methods that we select, so reading, writing, picture-based activities, what we factor in and how these coordinate with different learning, communication styles, and emotional states.
And then you'll see here, we're showcasing one of the animated GIFs that we created for the tool. We have a series of these throughout the tool. Something like this is also developed with empathy in mind. We put empathy at the forefront of what we were doing with this really difficult topic. And this is an example here of, instead of including a video of an actual child who might be experiencing a physical developmental delay, we made hyper accurate but illustrated versions of this. It's just a little bit more supportive and less upsetting to see an animated version of some of these delays rather than an actual video of a child who might be struggling. And then similarly, throughout the site, we used affirming language instead of clinical or scary language. And based on our research findings, we really emphasized that parents know their children best. So from the front page of this site, we have, "Remember, all children develop in different ways. This tool can serve as a guide if you have a feeling that something is wrong. You know your child best." So in review here, we used empathetic language and testing materials, as Taryn had said. We used much more expressive activities in our testing, like collaging. And we used neutral affirming language and created illustrated GIFs instead of video to illustrate the different developmental delays. And again, we're just gonna ask you to see if there's anything that you could be doing in your work, anything you could be taking from this section on empathy.
Another characteristic we wanted to touch on is making sure things are easy to understand and use for everyone. So show, don't tell is probably one of the most frequently given pieces of advice among writers, and we can also apply it in our technology as well. So Communicate Health worked with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health to develop an app that helps first responders communicate with people who have hearing impairments, limited English proficiency, or cognitive delays through icon-driven communication. So during an emergency, first responders and first receivers need to give information to and gather it from disaster victims. Show Me for Emergencies helps. This, by simply passing the phone or tablet with the app back and forth, both parties can show exactly what they mean and what they want to communicate. So to ensure this app was easy to understand and use, we first needed to understand the communication needs of each group. To do this, Communicate Health conducted multiple rounds of testing, from formative in-depth interviews, the usability testing, as well as specific icon testing, with both public health professionals and individuals with access and functional needs. So from this research, we gathered valuable insights that highlight that every individual with access and functional needs has different needs. So even in considering this primary group, there's additional needs within each of those segmentations of that group. And then the considerations during an emergency add an additional layer to that. Now, individuals with specific access and functional needs, perhaps related to speech or language access, have very specific needs, which testing with these diverse populations highlighted. And then also to supplement these findings, first responders shared a lot about the need to establish trust, both when in an emergency situation with individuals of varying needs, but more generally as well. And so our work was finding ways to blend and combine all of these needs into a functional app that would serve both for the ease of communication, so that both parties would be able to easily understand each of the tools, all of the icons that are used, and be able to communicate.
From a design perspective, you can see how we are trying to make this as easy as possible for folks who have a variety of needs. So it's icon-based communication. Folks do not need to speak the same language in order to communicate with one another. So this icon-based stuff is really interesting, but we also did quite a bit of functionality things that also helped for folks who might be in an emergency situation. So one thing we did with this app was to plan for offline viewing during connectivity outages. So what the app does is it stores your data, it saves the exact state you were in, and remembers what the user was doing when signal drops. So this is super important if you're in a natural disaster or some other type of emergency in which your internet is going to be unreliable. It's also designed specifically to move a pair of a first responder and a user in one emergency situation at a time, very linearly, getting to exactly what people need, and gives users the most useful icons by default. So the ones that we tested to be the most useful, and also it remembers the icons that you have chosen in the past for quick reference.
So in review, and ensuring our technology is easy to understand and use, we used varied methods to assess ease of use and comprehension, incorporated needs from all users, as I discussed, the consideration for first responders, as well as people who have access and functional needs, and then those additional needs that umbrella from there. Using hyper-readable text, so large, sans serif, and title case, and leaned on icon-based communication to meet the needs of anyone in an emergency situation. So again, we invite you to consider, what could you use in your work to help ensure tools are easy to use and understand by all? Now, in order to include all users, as researchers and designers, we need to do a better job of including their perspective in the UX research. So for this project, let's focus a bit on the research side of things. Prepareforyourcare.org is a website designed to make it easier for older adults and their loved ones to plan for their future healthcare needs. So the site walks people through steps, including videos and action steps, to help them talk with their doctors, family, and friends about healthcare decisions, and to fill out advanced directive forms. Advanced care planning is an important way to ensure that wishes for healthcare are honored, and it can also be challenging to discuss this topic with loved ones. So as part of our research process, CH conducted a usability audit to address initial usability concerns before conducting testing with this target population. The audit provided an initial touch point to empathize with the user experience, as well as address any initial usability concerns that would make it even more challenging for the study participants. Usability testing is a great way to learn about the needs and challenges of users. And a critical part of this research was to redefine who our core user was. So the site is intended for older adults, and we made the next step of making sure to recruit not just older adults, but those with low health literacy. So by identifying our core audience as the core audience plus as being those with lower health literacy, we were able to capture the needs of all. So in crafting our research, we made sure to use very simple usability tasks with plain language. So as discussed before with the collaging and the focus groups, it's really important to note what tools we're using through our research and making sure it maps appropriately with the populations that we're discussing. So making sure to focus on language that is simple and easy to use, as well as presenting specific tools, perhaps ratings that give participants a really concrete and easy means of connecting their thoughts to the activity at hand. So in looking at the research, I wanted to share this brief snippet of a usability session in which a participant goes through the login flow. So they already have their username entered and their password. They enter their email address and select create account. So what they're missing there is that it requires both a second password entry, and they also had an error in their email address. So the prompts that they receive says there may be an incorrect email address and prompts him again to enter his password. So the participant again enters the password, does not enter a secondary password, and doesn't have any confirmation of where the error was. We blurred out his email address for privacy, but he also had a comma that was in his email address. So instead of .com, it was .com. So in these error messages, he didn't clearly see exactly where his error was. And at this point, he assumed that the only next step was to use as a guest. So we didn't have his dialogue, but also in his dialogue, he's communicating that what this is communicating is that the password and email aren't matched, rather than not having a second email and a second password entered. So at this point, this was an unsuccessful attempt at creating an account that could easily be resolved by making a few design tweaks.
As Taryn mentioned, this was a research and usability recommendations heavy project for us, and not so much a design heavy project for us. But one thing we were able to do in order to meet the needs of the low literacy older adults was to make recommendations directly from this testing. So it's very, very important that folks create an account with prepareforyourcare.org. Otherwise, it does not save your preferences. So we needed to make sure that the feedback that folks are getting in their login is very, very explicit and clearly tied to where the error occurred. So you can see here, we have an example email address that uses a comma instead of a period for .com, and just like the user had done. And so we have direct feedback here that that was the issue.
So in review, for this study, we recruited not just older adults, but those with lower health literacy. And in crafting our task, made sure they were simple and included plain language. We also conducted a usability audit to capture any issues ahead of testing and simplified the flow to add clear feedback. So again, we ask you to consider, what could you use in your work to better include design and testing with the people who will use it?
So we're going to have you revisit your activity that you had done earlier. So take a look again at the website or app that you identified, and based on what you have learned so far in this presentation about accessibility, empathy, ease of use, how might it change in your rating? And we'd love to hear that in questions or comments at the end. So just take a moment. We're going to give you a few minutes to think through this and adjust your ratings if need be. And now we're going to revisit our other activity as well. So our question is, after this presentation, what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of accessibility, and has it changed? We're again going to ask you to go to slido.com and enter that same code, and a new poll should show up for you. And again, you'll be able to see a word cloud of perhaps some new words that folks are integrating. I'm seeing some of the same themes here. So a lot of inclusivity, which we saw in the first poll, but also some new words, empathy, everyone, context. Some great words coming up here.
Yeah, making the inclusion of awareness, I think that's definitely a critical part in designing for inclusivity, is being aware of your users and able to see target users and some additional characteristics of what could be included when we're considering those target users as well.
Okay, so it appears like we don't have any more answers rolling in. So that actually brings us to the end of our presentation and the beginning of the part where you can ask us some questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
There is a question down in the Q&A. Can you see that?
Yes, so I can take this one. So it says, how did you specifically recruit people who use screen readers, and how might we conduct a usability session with them remotely? Also wanted to hear about other groups too and what considerations we should meet. So to recruit individuals that do use screen readers, we reached out to groups that serve low vision users. So for example, different support groups or community organizations. So again, using that as a great resource for recruiting specific target users. And during this, in this screener, we actually had different segmentations of the types of accessibility tools that are used. And in the screener, we specifically asked what assistive tech devices that were used. Oftentimes, and for this screener, we actually spoke directly with participants or potential respondents as a way of really keeping it more open-ended, especially when working with the variety of assistive technology there are a lot of additional variations that capturing in a very rigid screener can make it very challenging. So directly connecting with respondents was really helpful in recruiting. So in conducting these usability sessions, remote is definitely a more challenging venue, as we've all been adjusting to and learning in most recent months. One of the key pieces that we found is really helpful is to do technical checks ahead of sessions, where we're able to walk through the entire technical setup with the participant. And in doing this, they feel comfortable in what the setup and the framework is, as well as we know that the session from a technical aspect will go smoothly. Typically, we use teleconferencing methods, such as Zoom, and do screen sharing. And also found it really important to test on the devices that people typically use themselves naturally. For example, some people may use an iPad so that they can zoom in. So the ability to just use the existing interface there, as well as having the screen reading accessibility feature turned on. And we can hear that through the audio. So great question, and definitely a lot to consider there. And also something to flag here is it's really important that we find to do kind of initial runs of all sessions, ideally with someone who shares characteristics of the target audience, so that we can catch any of the technical issues, any of the challenges that may present ahead of the testing during the session with participants, because we also recognize that can bring additional strain if there's additional technical challenges that present.
We have another question from Megan asking, are there any other trainings, blogs, or books you would recommend for learning more about accessible and inclusive design? A couple of things come to mind for me. Derek Featherstone does really great work around this. His website is simplyaccessible.com. He's also been a presenter at an event apart. And when I most recently attended an event apart, they were doing some great work around inclusivity in the web design and front-end development sphere. Taryn, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's pretty inclusive. I don't have any specifics off top. And then I see, so there's a question if we did in-depth interviews in addition to focus groups and usability tests. Yes, we did across these, as well as a number of other studies. We find it's really helpful, especially during initial understanding of users. So across a lot of our work, we find it really valuable to do in-depth interviews. I don't know if there's additional kind of focus around that question, but yes, we do include that in our methods.
We have a hand raised. I was going to go ahead and let him ask that question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
You're unmuted.
Hi, yeah, I'm a girl or a woman, but my question was following up on the first one. So I work for well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation and all of the awesome information you're giving. It's really, really helpful and important. My question is, I do user research with a remote company. Like, we've been remote for the last 10 years. And so when this has come up in the past, something I would love to know more about, or maybe find more information on, is how to do usability testing with people who are hard of hearing or have hearing issues. Like, are captions enough? Is there more that I could be doing on my side or on, to help out with that and still be able to include them in my research?
That's a great question. And I don't think we have, I know I personally haven't addressed that from a remote perspective. So I can check in with my team and we can contact and get back to you. I know we've done a number of other studies that I may not have directly been part of, but I think, and that is definitely a really great part to note, is what that adjustment is like from the remote side as well.
All right, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for the question.
We have another question from Andrea. The question is, the projects that you spoke about seem like they could have both primary users and their caregivers as important target users. The question is, how do you decide whom to research and design with across those groups? I'm going to give my answer, and then I'm going to let Taryn, as the researcher, give her answer as well. So the way that our work typically works is that we're researching the primary users of the information. So the people who need the information are typically the ones that we study and choose to focus on, whereas the subject matter experts are actually our clients. And so we're getting their feedback through the product development process. Sometimes, though, we do also have healthcare providers as an audience. And in that case, we would study both the primary users and the caregivers. And Taryn, I'll let you add to that if you want.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, to piggyback off what Marika said, I'd say ultimately it really depends on the study, because there are cases where, as Marika mentioned, it will be the say the caregivers or RSA, or sorry, the primary users are who we're working with, as well as like who the client is. But we do have a number of studies where we do speak with multiple. So actually the AEI study was a great example of that, where we have both consumers to really indicate those who have existing eye disease and seeking to ensure that that website is readily accessible for them, but then also working with NEI partners kind of brings a different scope. And so it really just depends on the project, what the scope of the work is, and really think it's important to target and understand the thoughts and motivations for each group. So even if we're just specifically doing research, say with the user, also really helpful to consider other stakeholders in that. So just to include another example, I do a lot of work. So this is going into caregivers in a different sense for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, in which we do continued segmentation of both individuals who are the beneficiary of Medicare, who are using Medicare and have Medicare as their coverage, but also the individuals who are their caregivers, and identifying what some of their needs and what the use of tools looks like for them, in addition to working with professionals who work with Medicare tools on a regular basis. So all in all, it depends. The long way of saying that.
Yep, agreed. Okay, we have another great question from Dan. How to recommend gaining buy-in from IT partners to consider or add accessibility to their process on all platforms. So I think what this question is asking is, how do we get buy-in from web developers on accessibility in developing products? I'm going to answer that question. A great way to advocate for your user is to use data, and also to emphasize the scalability of accessibility and inclusion. So the scalability is a concept that if you are creating something that helps one type of user, you are not just helping that one type of user, you're also helping other users who might be in different situations, whether they be permanent, temporary, or just situational. So a good example of that is adding subtitles to movies. You may think that's just for deaf or hard of hearing users, but it also would help somebody who is temporarily hard of hearing, say they have an ear infection, or it would also help somebody who is situationally hard of hearing, so a bartender at a crowded bar, or somebody in a noisy airport or something like that. So there's a bunch of different ways to think about this too. So another one is if you are designing for some people with limb differences who only have one arm, for instance, that can be a permanent disability. Somebody can just have a limb difference. That can also be a temporary disability if somebody has injured their arm, or it can be just a situational disability where they're carrying their child in one arm and they only have one arm free. So it's taking into consideration that when you are helping one population, you're in fact helping most of the population. And then there are some great statistics out there about the percentage of people who are disabled. It's 1 out of every 5 Americans has a disability. And so that's a huge number of people who are using your products. And if you're not designing it for them, then who are you designing it for? Anything to add to that, Taryn?
No, I think that's really great. I think a lot of it is, I mean, especially in getting buy-in, to your point about really pulling in how this expands. And I think that's a lot of what we're discussing today is, while looking at accessibility, I know often like that first word cloud we went with, or we're thinking about things like disability or other challenges that may present for someone for an extended period, but also how that inclusion expands to individuals in all cases. And so like really designing for inclusivity is beneficial to all.
A quick question from Nick. How many researchers do you have on staff? Taryn, do you know that one?
Ooh,
Do our best.
I feel we're around 15. We have a number of projects coming in and a number of staff at various levels to help with that. So yeah, I think around 15. I haven't done an exact count in a minute.
We just got a report that it's 15 to 18 researchers on our staff.
Oh, okay.
We were very, very close.
Great. And then Mel asked, what is your go-to tool for testing a website for accessibility? I'd say I don't specifically have a set tool that I utilize. Usability.gov does have some great accessibility resources, as well as like Health Literacy Online on health.gov. There's a lot of great tools and resources for additional health literacy and accessibility considerations. Veronica, did you have any specific tools that you also use?
So I'm going to tell you about some design tools that I use. We focus a lot on color contrast in our fonts. So there's a couple of apps you can use. There's Color Contrast Analyzer, which is a free app that you can download. You can also use a paid app for Mac that's called Contrast. And those will tell you if the background and the font have high enough contrast to be legible. I am also trying to think of some tools that others on our staff might use. There is a tool called Lighthouse, which is a web developer tool from Google developers, and a tool called DEQ, which is DEQUE. And that's a monitor that will scan and report on the accessibility status of your website. So I'll post those in the chat so that folks don't have to remember those names.
All right. And then Eduardo asked, what changes are you seeing in the healthcare space as more channels are being added beyond websites and mobile apps, such as chatbots, virtual assistants, personal assistants, smart speakers, etc.? Actually, I really like this question because I think you did highlight like a number of elements that are starting to be included, and we're also seeing these elements being incorporated into healthcare, especially a lot of consumer-facing products. And so in that, I think it's really important for us to have more of a focus on how to ensure inclusivity in the use of these tools. So I think there is a lot of benefit, especially from an accessibility standpoint of some of these and switching to more audio tools in some cases. But I think it is really important, especially in the development of healthcare tools, to make sure, again, we're testing with the diverse set of users so that we are capturing all of their needs in that realm. I think we especially see it with older adults. It's been really interesting gaining additional insights from what their involvement is with tech as populations that have less technical literacy are aging and also having need to use specific healthcare resources, are seeing with the number of partners how those users are being incorporated and even prioritized in the development of these tools.
We have a question about if we have any tips for recruiting the literacy participants. I'm going to say from my knowledge, not on the research side, that we do have a personal relationship with a reading and literacy center. So we were able to recruit participants from them at some point. And I know, Karen, you probably have a more in-depth answer about this.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, really important part or like a really helpful part is to work directly with community centers, especially so in looking at low literacy, you have both like low literacy and just general literacy. We can also segment that into health literacy as well as tech literacy. And so in going into health literacy and tech literacy, that work with community centers is especially valuable because sometimes you may be working on a tool, maybe it's something that is more shifting away from digital, and how are you going to use digital products to recruit individuals who have low tech literacy that are not using digital tools. So really invaluable to work with the community partners there, as well as in screeners. And we have a number of questions that assess health literacy skills. So asking questions about their comfort, discussing health-related topics, understanding health-related forms. So thinking of like, as you go to a doctor's office, as you're reading those forms, to what extent do you need help? And from respondents' answers to those questions, we use that to form an understanding based on like a ranking system to get an understanding of what their health literacy is and their comfort with some of these more health-focused conversations and discussions.
Another question for you, Taryn. Do we offer research services for organizations that don't have dedicated research teams?
Yes, completely. We actually have a number of organizations that we work with that don't have dedicated research teams. And a lot of our focus from the research team is really explaining what our research is, what benefit it can provide to your organization, and connecting that back to what the organization needs are. So in crafting all of our materials, well, of course, having the focus on the user's needs, oftentimes we also will work with organizations to identify what their immediate needs are, even the greater meaning or purpose behind the tool, to make sure we're able to capture that in our research. A great question, Rachel. And then also looks like there's another question from Rachel. Do you know of tools for mobile app accessibility? Could you maybe tell a bit more what you mean specifically? Because I feel like that's very broad. Like for the testing of mobile app or actual access?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. I've been doing a lot of, as far as screen reader technology specifically, and other types of accessibility within native mobile apps. I noticed there's a lot of tools for websites that analyze websites, but there doesn't seem to be much for mobile apps. I also was doing some work with a chatbot and screen reader technology, and found a lack of kind of resources or good examples to go off of. So I was wondering if you had any experience with that.
I don't immediately specifically for mobile. I think oftentimes when we've tested on mobile is working with the existing, well, testing the use of those existing resources and assistive technologies that participants are naturally using, and often testing on mobile, but we didn't necessarily shift tools to do that testing.
Okay, so it sounds like it was more like mobile web.
Pardon?
It sounds like it was primarily mobile web, like a web app on a mobile device.
Yeah, so testing, yeah, not specifically testing specific apps from that accessibility lens with screen readers.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Okay, it looks like we are both at the end of our time and at the end of our questions, which is great timing. If anybody wants to follow up with Taryn or I, feel free to email us. It's just our first names at communicatehealth.com. And thank you for USPH for having us today. We really enjoyed sharing our knowledge with you.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you. So Carm here, Director of Education. Thank you, Taryn and Marika, for joining us from Communicate Health. Again, guys, we do have some upcoming short courses and webinars, and Communicate Health will be with us again in August for inclusive research. So make sure you stay tuned to that and visit the education tab on uxpa.org for more information about our short courses and webinars. Thank you again, Taryn and Marika. And thank you, everyone else. Have a good rest of your day. And the recording will be made available within 72 hours. Okay? All righty, guys.
Thanks all.
Thank you.